topic that I was given to talk about today has really exercised the Middle East for the last 100 years. I mean, it may have exercised this country for a while, but it's been at the heart of all the political crises, conflicts of the area since 1915. And if you recall, in one of the most unfortunate events of recent times, which is the eruption of ISIS onto the stage in the Middle East, one of the first things that they claimed that they were doing was to remove Sykes-Picot. Very few people had heard of Sykes-Picot outside of the Middle East, but in the Middle East it's become, as it were, a shorthand for all that is connoted by the word betrayal and deceit and perfidy. And there was, I think, a well-known clip from a Daesh video film which showed them physically removing the barriers between Iraq and Syria, the frontier barriers, and claiming that this was the end of Sykes-Picot. So memories run long in our part of the world, and nothing is more resonant of the confusion that we found ourselves in more than these three episodes. In a few years, within 2 years, the entire map of the Middle East was remade. Now, Britain's policy in the Middle East, which is the subtitle of the lecture, obviously you can go back to the days of Queen Elizabeth and the Levant Trade Company and so on, but these didn't have any long-term implications for British policy in the area. Serious thinking started about Britain's role in the Middle East, or what was then known as the Near East, with the appointment of Stratford Canning as the first, well, it was his second assignment as ambassador, but he spent nearly more than a decade in the mid-19th century working out British policy towards the Ottoman Empire, and in the process articulating what was going to be the foundations of British policy in the Middle East generally. And during his tenure, two very important trends evolved that guided British policy regarding the Near East. And when I say the Ottoman Empire, at that point, all the Arab lands of the Middle East and North Africa, bits and pieces of North Africa were being taken over by France, but by and large, all the Arabic-speaking territories of the Middle East and North Africa were under Ottoman rule. So, in effect, British policy towards the Ottomans implied British policy towards the Arabs by implication. And there, the main issue is whether the Ottoman Empire could reform itself, and what should the role of Britain be in this process? How is this ramshackle empire, as seen obviously from the Occidental perspective? It wasn't ramshackle from the Ottoman perspective. How is this ramshackle empire going to reform itself, rejuvenate itself, and be able to join, as it were, the Committee of Nations without its breakup leading to an enormous power vacuum and the fodder for further crises and conflicts with the other powers? The main conclusion at that point by Stratford Canning and also by the various prime ministers who were in charge of the country at that point was that there seems to be an inherent contradiction between the principles of reforming the Ottoman state, which would lead to becoming supposedly more European, more institutionalized, and in the process losing its credibility as an entity that's based on its own indigenous understanding of state and power. And the other trend was that while this empire was being reformed, maybe we should take bits and pieces over it, or be able to impose a kind of protectorate over those parts of the Ottoman Empire that are fundamental to the interest, the long-term interests of this country. So these two contradictory policies were sort of the background, as it were, to the three major events during the war, which formed, as it were, British policy in the area. How do you change and reform the state or states in the Near East? And to what extent should these states fall under the direct or indirect tutelage of Western powers, in particular Britain? By the time, towards the end of the 19th century, Britain became known as a protector of Ottoman integrity, primarily because there was a sense that if Britain didn't play that role, the Russian bear would move on to Constantinople, and there would be a fundamental shift in the balance of power as it relates to British interests in India. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was being attacked at its periphery. France took over Algeria in the 1830s, and followed by imposing a protectorate on Tunisia. So you had pieces of the empire falling under Western or European influence. And Britain joined the fray, as it were, after the uprising in Egypt of Arabi Pasha, where it imposed a protectorate on Egypt and took over Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. So the dismemberment of the empire, apart from its retreat in the Balkans, was taking place at quite a rapid rate towards the end of the 19th century, which led to trends inside the British Foreign Office. Salisbury, at that point, was Prime Minister, who thought that the best solution for this continuing state of affairs was to, in fact, partition the empire into various pieces, either directly as protectorates or as spheres of influence. And various schemes were proposed in the late 19th century as to how to deal with the empire, which was mainly at that point an Turco-Arab empire. The Ottoman Empire had lost most of its Balkan provinces, has lost its Christian majority, and became by and large a Muslim majority, or overwhelmingly Muslim majority empire by the beginning of the 20th century. So this was one school of thought, which is to do with control, dismemberment, and during the late 19th century, there were a number of Ottoman crises that led to the imposition of direct financial control by France and Britain over its affairs. Another discourse also started sometime in the late 19th century, which is in fact to look at the empire from its religious perspective, and whether the caliphate, which was the other linchpin of the rule of the sultans, whether the caliphate should not be moved from Turkish hands to Arab hands. And a number of late Victorian figures, like Wilfred Scowen Blunt, Birdwood, who called for the breakup of the empire, not so much so that it falls under European spheres of influence, but rather for it to re-emerge as an Arab caliphate. So the idea of Arab territories as somehow forming an integral part of a post-Ottoman order also evolved during that period. So these were the things that were in the background when World War I had started. Of course, the Ottomans had broken with their historic relationship with Britain as their ultimate protector against Russian encroachments. And by the time World War I had started, August 1914, the Ottomans were locked in with a secret agreement with the Germans. And within 2 months or 3 months after the outbreak of war on the Western Front, the Ottomans became belligerents when they allowed the two German naval vessels to be rebranded as Ottoman ships, and they attacked the Russian ports in the Black Sea. That, of course, brought in Britain as a belligerent against the empire, and the whole issue of what to do with the Arab territories of the empire rose again. And one of the first attempts to begin to fashion a policy to the post-Ottoman order in the Middle East was a committee established by Herbert Asquith, who was then Prime Minister, headed by Maurice de Bunsen, who was Assistant Under-Secretary of State, to come up with a set of proposals as to how to deal with the empire after a successful conclusion of the war. Now, the de Bunsen Committee, its terms of reference were, quote, to consider the nature of British desiderata in Turkey and Asia in the event of a successful conclusion of the war. And then it was thought that the war against the Ottomans or the Turks would be short-lived. It would be a matter of a few months and the Ottomans would sue for peace. This was just the beginning of the campaign in Gallipoli before the disaster unfolded. So there wasn't much credence given to the Turks as real opponents or real belligerents, and people thought that it would be a matter of months before the Turks would sue for peace. The whole, the impulse behind the establishment of the de Bunsen Committee was a note that the Russians sent to the British a few months beforehand, where they reasserted their claims on Constantinople, the Bosphorus littoral, and the straits leading to the Sea of Marmara. This in turn led to the French sending a note to the Foreign Office or to the British demanding Kilikia, which is what is now northwest Syria, all of Syria, and by Syria they meant Syria including Palestine, which is very important. And the French wanted to have a special role as protectors of the Christian holy places of the Ottoman Empire. In the process of looking at the various alternatives that were available, the various options and the policy alternatives, the de Bunsen Committee included a number of people from various departments, most notably Sir Mark Sykes, who props up later as a co-signatory of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes was appointed to the committee to the, I think its formal name was the Interdepartmental Agency for Asiatic Turkey. He was appointed there by the Secretary of War, Lord Kitchener. In the 3 or 4 months that the de Bunsen Committee met, they came up with what in fact became, in one form or another, the foundation stones of British policy towards the Middle East or towards the Near East during World War I. It was based on 9 desiderata, as he called them. The first one is recognition and consolidation of Britain's position in the Persian Gulf. At that point, Britain had signed a number of treaties with the principalities of the area, in particular the Emir of Kuwait, the Emir of Muhammara, which is the Arab majority provinces now of Khuzestan, the Trucial states. So there's a whole string of treaties that were signed with local chieftains, primarily to secure navigation and communications with India, and to begin to take a peek at the burgeoning oil industry. The second desiderata of the British was open trade and markets in Asiatic Turkey. They wanted to ensure that the whole area of the Near East, of what was then called Turkey in Asia or Asiatic Turkey, would be open to British trade. The third was fulfilling pledges made to the emirs and chieftains of the Persian Gulf, and to, quote unquote, the people of Basra. There were a number of other parties who were included, who had one way or another, had one connection or another with the British, such as the Idrisi in the Yemen, the Emir of Najd, the Ibn Saud, Imam Yahya of Yemen, and so on. They're part of the scheme of things that de Bunsen worked out. The fourth is security for investments in oil, river navigation, and irrigation projects, basically opening the area to British investment. The fifth was, and this is very interesting, the fifth was to develop Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, into a major corn and grain growing area for the British Empire, and to open it up for colonization from India. There were plans that were set afoot and nearly came to realization of importing a large number of people from India as plantation workers in Iraq. The sixth was to secure communications in the Eastern Mediterranean, and by that, obviously, they meant Cyprus and the Suez Canal. The seventh is to ensure that the Muslim holy places and Arabia as a whole, by that one would mean the Arabian Peninsula excluding Aden, would stay under Muslim rule, primarily not to antagonize the Muslims of India, and to find a resolution to the Khilafah or the Caliphate after the deposition of the Ottoman sultans, with the intention, supposedly, of bringing an Arab caliph. Eighth is to find a solution of the Armenian problem. And ninth is to find a settlement of Palestine and the holy places of Christendom. The last three desiderata were explicitly left without being fleshed out because Damascus and then the government wanted to leave it to be sorted out with discussions with other powers. So that was the background to the next major episode in British involvement in the Middle East. And that is the McMahon-Hussein letters or correspondence. Now, Sir Henry McMahon was, these are maps associated with the Damascus Committee as to how to deal with post-war Asiatic Turkey. And it went through a gamut of alternatives, including keeping Turkey in a very weak state, but dividing its territories in a decentralized way into Anatolia, mainly Turkey, Armenia, which was supposed to include large parts of Iraq, in fact, Syria, and the area which was called Jazeera Iraq, basically the land between the two rivers, and Palestine stretching from Sinai right into the Anbar Desert of Iraq. The other alternatives was to provide protectorates, and here we had Russian protectorates, as you can see, potential Greek state in Western Anatolia, British interest with the parallel stripes, and so on. This was the Ottoman administrative map of the Middle East at the outbreak of wars, mainly Syria. And it's divided into the wilayats of Syria itself, of Sham, wilayat of Aleppo, of Halab, and then the coastal wilayats, which includes the Sanjak of Jerusalem, which accounts for mainly most of pre-mandate Palestine is there. And then the Sanjak of Lebanon, which had its own autonomous status. This was Sir Henry McMahon. He was a commissioner, high commissioner in Egypt between 1915 and 1917. And he was allowed by the prime minister at that point to start discussions with the Emir of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, with a view of having him launch a revolt against the Ottomans. There had been some discussions prior to 1915 between the sons of Sharif Hussein, in particular Abdullah, and various representatives of the British government before World War I in Egypt, in particular Kitchener. And there was some talk whether the British would support an uprising by the Emir of Mecca in the event that his position was abolished by the Sultan. The position of the Emir of Mecca, or the Sharif of Mecca, which gave him control of the Hajj, was a very important position in the Ottoman Empire and was a gift of the Ottoman Sultan rather than the government or the Ottoman parliament. So there was some fear that the Young Turks might strip the family of Sharif Hussein of the Emirate of Mecca and give it to a rival clan. So there were some discussions with Kitchener at that point and Ronald Storrs, who was a political advisor in Egypt, whether the British would support an uprising against the Ottomans before World War I. This is around 1912. The British were very firm by saying no, they wouldn't. They continued to believe in the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. But by the time the war had started, obviously they had different perspectives on the problem. So Sir Henry McMahon was given was instructed to begin a series of exchanges with Sharif Hussein to see how and under what terms and conditions the Arabs, quote unquote, under the leadership of the Emir of Mecca, would launch a revolt against the British. Prior to these discussions, a few months prior to that, there were discussions between Emir Faisal, one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, and the nascent Arab nationalist movement that was based in Damascus as to what would happen if the Ottoman Empire crumbled, what will be the position of the Arabs. And there was a number of secret societies that had evolved from trying to create a joint Turco-Arab kingdom into demanding complete decentralization, into a position where they would support a revolt against the Ottomans if the Western powers would guarantee some or make a commitment to an independent Arab state. So prior to the correspondences between McMahon and Hussein, there was a series of discussions that included Hussein's son, Faisal, in Damascus, which created something called the Damascus Protocol, which is a very important document because it underlay the position of Sharif Hussein vis-a-vis McMahon. In the Damascus Protocol, it was agreed that if the Arabs, broadly understood, were to join a revolt against the Ottomans, the quid pro quo would be support for an independent Arab state that included nearly all the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire, of course excluding Egypt, which was in the British protectorate, and excluding the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, which were British colonies of Aden and related territories. So the entire Arabian Peninsula, including the Hijaz, right up to what is now Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, right up to Iraq, would be an independent Arab state. So in the back of Hussein's mind, when these letters with McMahon were exchanged, was the state, the form of the state that was going to arise as a result of this adventure. The most important of the letters that were exchanged between Hussein and McMahon is the one of October 24th, 1915. In that letter, which was written by Sir Henry McMahon to Hussein, who was constantly in his exchanges with McMahon demanding a commitment to a territorial understanding of an Arab state, McMahon made it very clear that Britain would support the formation of an Arab state that would be under, this is Sharif Hussein of Mecca, that would run from a line Mersin to Alexandretta in the north, right down to the Indian Ocean, excluding the crown colony of Aden. In that letter, Hussein said, set out his proposals, and McMahon wrote back to him, quote, the districts of Mersin and Alexandretta and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo cannot be said to be purely Arab and must on that account be accepted from the proposed delimitation. Subject to that modification, and without prejudice to the treaties concluded between us and certain Arab chiefs, we accept that delimitation, as for the regions lying within the proposed frontiers, in which Great Britain is free to act without detriment to interests of her ally France, I am authorized to give you the following pledges on behalf of the government of Great Britain, and to reply as follows to your note. Quote, that subject to the modifications stated above, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and uphold the independence of the Arabs in all the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca. That was, as it were, the smoking gun that Hussein was looking for, and all letters after that were based on this understanding. Of course, these letters became subject to huge debate subsequently, whether these were pledges, these were just wishful thinking, whether McMahon exceeded his remit, whether Hussein understood the nuances of the English language, because all these letters had to be translated back and forth into Arabic, whether this kind of pledge had an out clause in it, the out clause being subject to the interests of our ally France, and whether this was a binding document or not has been debated now for nearly 100 years. And there was a special committee of inquiry that met to discuss this matter in the 1930s. The general conclusion by all those who read them again, without parsing it to the nth degree, is that it was a commitment. And it was a commitment to support the formation of an independent Arab state within the territories delimited, within the geographical terrain delimited here. That, of course, led to the next great document that governed Britain's relations and policies in the Middle East, which is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement came quickly after the Damascus, the one that I mentioned earlier, the Damascus Committee meeting. The general thinking is that Sykes-Picot is something that was drummed up between Sir Mark Sykes, Fedas Faisal, who was the leader of the Arab Revolt, the field leader of the Arab Revolt, with a picture of him, General Allenby in Damascus. And that's the governor, Jamal Pasha, whose execution of a large number of Arab nationalist elements, patriots, and notables in 1915 tipped the balance decisively in favor of revolt against the Ottomans, as it affected Faisal himself, because he was the interlocutor with these people. This is Sir Mark Sykes. Sir Mark Sykes really had some very interesting history, very interesting background. He was from a sort of a well-known Yorkshire family, and was known as a person who was quite adept at all matters Eastern. He was a member of Parliament, and for a while became the main sort of go-to person as it related to issues of the Near East. He was a very strange man because he had quite contradictory qualities. But he was undoubtedly a person who knew a lot about the Ottoman world, had traveled through the area, and knew something about it. He was very close to Kitchener, and Kitchener brought him into the as an advisor into the cabinet just at the outbreak of war. The other party to this is Mr. Francois Picot, who was again a French diplomat, but not as colorful a figure as Sir Mark Sykes. Now, again, the trigger for this thing was the demand of the Russians for a recognized status after the war. And following the Damascus Committee, the Russians continued to press for a meeting that would translate all of the recommendations and policy positions of the Bunsen Committee into actual territorial claims. And when the Sykes-Picot Agreement came out, it included territories that were kept for Russia also. It doesn't show here on the map. This is the map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Ottoman territories into a number of units that would, one way or another, be connected to the Allies, the Western Allies. We have, it was divided into, the agreement itself appeared to reconcile all the competing objectives of the Russians. The Italians also had an interest. The Greeks wanted to be included in it because they wanted to take over Western Anatolia, but mainly the British and the French. It was an attempt to, as it were, square the circle here. And the territories were color-coded, and I'll try to explain them now. The blue is where France would have a direct control, either ruling them as colonies or as direct protectorates. The red, which includes nearly all of Iraq now, all of modern Iraq, from north of Baghdad right to the Gulf, were to be ruled directly by the British. The ones that are shaded blue were areas where an independent Arab state would be allowed. The A area would be under French guidance, supervision, and the B area would be under British supervision. And the yellow area was supposed to be an international protectorate for the Holy Land and Palestine, most of Palestine. So, Russia was given the Straits of the Sea of Marmara and the Straits of the Bosphorus, plus direct control over Constantinople. Now, if you look at it, it's really quite strange because you're giving independence to areas that are basically unpopulated. These are mainly desert lands, the A and B areas. While the more sort of advanced territories, which included nearly all of the Syrian coast, because you had, the modern cities of Beirut, for example, was there, and Baghdad, Baghdad and Basra, which were getting into the modern age, under direct colonial rule. So in many ways, it was a contradictory designation of these territories, away from their natural state. Now, the Sykes-Picot Agreement remains secret, and it came out as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution and the first Commissar of Foreign Affairs, Trotsky, released the agreement to show the perfidy of the imperialist powers, and it burst onto the scene in the Middle East, in the Arab world, really in the middle of the Arab revolt, and created a great deal of disturbance and tension. It was negotiated without the knowledge or participation of any of the Arab principals, in particular Sharif Hussein. And during the discussions between Hussein and McMahon, which we referred to earlier, McMahon knew of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but it was never mentioned that there was a secret agreement being hatched out. It is highly possible, these are one of the counterfactuals, that if Hussein had known about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the entire Arab revolt would not have happened. And I think the whole plans for it would have been scuppered. When it came out, at the very least, it appeared to the Arabs as a major breach of trust, a serious breach of trust. And it became more and more, created a great deal of discomfort in this country, because they had said a set of things that were to be understood in one way, only to have them exposed as being participants in the carve-up of the Middle East, which with no reference at all to the Hussein-McMahon exchanges, and with no reference at all to the possibility of independent Arab state in the map that had been agreed, or at least Hussein thought it was agreed with Sir Henry McMahon. There was a lot of talk whether Sharif Hussein knew about the details of the Sykes-Picot Agreement subsequently, after the exchange of the letters, but before their release by the Bolsheviks. But my research is, I think, it's really quite clear that he had no knowledge of it. Once this thing came out, Sykes and Picot were asked to go to the Middle East and to travel to the Hijaz, to Mecca, to allay the fears and apprehensions of the Arabs. This was in the middle of the revolt that this thing came about. And France was far more emphatic about what it wanted. And they were determined to have their say and their place in the carve-up of Syria. They wanted direct control over the entire Syrian coast, together with the hinterland. Mark Sykes, when he met with Hussein in the presence of Emir Faisal and Hussein's advisor, a Lebanese called Fuad al-Khatib, he tried to minimize the significance of this agreement. And he may have given some indirect comments about it, allusions and so on, without necessarily claiming that this is, a policy that was set in stone, as it were. He didn't disclose it. The fact of the matter is that when he met Hussein, he did not disclose the full import of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He hinted at it with inferences and allusions according to the minutes of the people who attended these meetings. And now Hussein and the Arabs generally were left, when I say the Arabs, I mean those Arabs who were associated with the Arab revolt and were in the entourage of the Hashemites. They had felt considerable unease as to what is Britain's true position and how it was going to affect the agreement that they had through the exchanges with Sir Henry McMahon. But I think Hussein wanted to believe the British, in spite of noises and indications to the contrary, that there was something being hatched that had nothing to do with ensuring he or his family's role as rulers of an independent Arab state. Hussein, from the beginning, had allowed some leeway for the British in Iraq. But it was always understood that Iraq was a special case because of its proximity to India and the involvement of the Mesopotamian, of the British Army in the Mesopotamian theater of war. But it was always to be temporary, that for the moment, Iraq, or those portions, what we'd call modern Iraq, were not included in his understanding of the boundaries of an Arab state immediately. But as soon as the war was over, it was understood that they would accede to that. Again, Britain did not contradict his understanding of how this special position of Iraq would fit in a post-war environment. It was left vague. But from the Arab point of view, from Hussein's point of view, there was very little doubt that Iraq was to be included into the future Arab state as soon as the war was over and the special circumstances of the war in Mesopotamia would come to an end. Now, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as such, was never implemented. I mean, we don't have states designed along these lines. But it reflected the drive of both France and Britain to have a very powerful say in the structure of the post-war order in the Middle East, either directly or through indirect rule. So some of the critics of the counter-critics, I would say, of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically their justification for it is that it was a useful exercise in trying to design a post-war order in order to minimize the threat of instability and competing powers fighting over territories. You might as well reach some kind of agreement beforehand. But in reality, it is really a shocking document because it imposes a certain understanding of rule and power that runs counter to what had already been promised and runs counter to some of the principles that were enunciated soon thereafter by President Wilson as to the major building blocks of the post-war order. The other profound development that affected the course of events in the Middle East was the declaration of the British government, the so-called Balfour Declaration, that committed Britain to support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The statement was in the form of a letter that was sent to Lord Rothschild by Arthur Balfour, Britain's foreign secretary at that period, on November 2nd, 1917, detailing the cabinet's policy position in support of political Zionism, albeit it was hedged with a qualification regarding some of the rights of the existing Arab populations of Palestine, which then accounted for something like 93% of the population. The message, it's a very short letter, but in it I think it's created more distress and anxiety and attempt to understand it than any few words have possibly. It reads, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." I can't go into the genesis of the within the time available, but it affected the course of the Middle East in a very, very dramatic way. First of all, it presupposed that the British government will have a free hand in Palestine as a territory directly under its control in order to give the declaration its effect. And in fact, the declaration was subsequently included in the mandate for Palestine. Secondly, it presupposed that the Arabs of Palestine, in whatever guise, nationalists, supporters of the cause of the Arab revolt, or just simply dwellers in Palestine, as a territory, will have no right to determine their political future, because civil and religious rights as such specifically exclude political rights. Of course, both of these clashed with the McDonald exchanges. And they also clashed with the designation of Palestine as a yellow territory with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, giving it some kind of international status. Now, the Arabs, especially Amir Sharif Hussein and also Faisal, were really very sympathetic to the cause of displaced Jews. And they would not have, and they had said so in many instances, they would not have objected to migration of Jews from Europe, from Eastern Europe, into Arab lands. And that they would be welcomed as refugees into these territories. But that was a far cry from acknowledging and accepting the claim that there was a right there for the establishment of a state. Now, the whole issue whether the Balfour Declaration implied or called for the establishment of a state, again, you have to pass what Jewish national home means. In reality, it was understood by those main protagonists to be one of the steps towards establishing a state. There was a big uproar in the Arab world, especially inside the ranks of the Arab revolt. And there was a sense of very deep betrayal of what they thought were Britain's commitment to an independent Arab state. And it reached a point where there was mutiny in several of the units that were attached to the Northern Army of Faisal. And as a result of this, the increasing tempo of these very dangerous sentiments, Britain sent out one of the main figures in something called the Arab Bureau in Cairo. The Arab Bureau in Cairo was a central point of information dissemination control, and acted as the policy on and the analysis of the British effort in the Middle East. A man called Hogarth, who was sent out to see Hussein, to see Sharif Hussein in Mecca. And he carried with him a message from the cabinet which said, in unequivocal terms, quote, Jewish settlement in Palestine would only be allowed insofar as would be consistent with the political and economic freedom of the Arab population. And this apparently unequivocal statement was enough for Hussein to send out instructions to allay the fears of the various parties who felt that they were being stabbed in the back, as it were. And this led again to the meeting between Weizmann and Faisal, where Weizmann again tried to allay the fears of Faisal that this was a step, the Balfour Declaration was a step towards the state. And during the discussion, unfortunately, there was only one person who kept note, a man called Joyce. And according to his notes, which were not really written up as formal minutes, Weizmann said that the intention was not to form a state, but rather to create a place for European, mainly East European Jews to feel at home and to have refuge. This really is the three big statements, as it were, that fashion the background to the formation of the state system in the modern Middle East. Of course, all of these things came to a head at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Faisal was invited to head the delegation of the Hijaz. At that point, the British had recognized Hussein as king of the Hijaz, although he claimed for himself the title of king of the Arabs. So they wouldn't allow an Arab Faisal to lead a delegation under the name of the Arab delegation, but rather the Hijaz delegation. And during the early months of the Paris Peace Conference, Faisal had proposed to the big four, who were the main leaders, Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Randall. He addressed them directly at a meeting, where he laid out once again the understanding that his father had and that the Arab revolt had of the state that was supposed to emerge as a result of the promises that the British made to the Arabs, embodied in the Hussein-McDonald exchanges. He had meanwhile established a state in Syria, that was supposed to be the nucleus of this state, and became subsequently the Kingdom of Syria in a very short life. It was brought down by the French, who insisted on implementing the terms of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain also, just after the end of hostilities, issued another statement, which seemed to confirm once again that they were backing the formation of an Arab state. And this was a statement made by the British authorities in Egypt to a group of people, 7 mainly Syrians. It's called the Declaration of the Seven, where the British made it clear that they supported the establishment of an independent Arab state in the territories that were under the control of the Arab armies. And the declaration said as follows: it came from the Foreign Office in the form of a statement. It was read by a man called Walden, who was the representative of the government in Egypt, to some of these authors, these 7 people, in the army headquarters in Egypt. It said that the British government affirmed that for territories that were already independent before the war, and those liberated by Arab armies, essentially the lands under the control of Faisal and his northern army, and the British government would recognize their complete and sovereign independence. For territories liberated by the Allied powers, and that would be Iraq and parts of Palestine, then the British government would act on the criteria that their future government should be based upon the principle of the consent of the governed. For territories still under Turkish control, it was the desire of His Majesty's government that the oppressed people in those territories should obtain their freedom and independence. And to most people, well, to any sensible person listening, reading this declaration, it was really a straightforward confirmation for Britain's support for Arab independence, with none of the caveats and hedging that accompanied the Hussein McMahon correspondence and subsequent prevarications and ambiguities of British officials. It also established the boundaries of the Arab region clearly, in a way that was no different from Hussein's understanding of it. Furthermore, the declaration established the principle that Britain sought the freedom and the independence of the Arabs and would not establish any government in their lands that would not have the consent of the people. Now, this dovetailed, of course, with Wilson's 14 points on that. And this was the atmosphere, this was the frame of mind when the Sheikh Hussein sent his son Faisal to head the delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. Of course, in the Paris Peace Conference, the whole thing fell apart. The idea that there would be such a Hussein McMahon exchanges were never given any credence. The idea that there would be an independent state was never given much support. And Faisal spent nearly a year and a half going back and forth between Damascus, Beirut, and Paris, trying to confirm and to reignite the pledges. But by then it was too late. The French were insistent on implementing the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The British, who had nearly something like 800,000 troops in the Middle East at the end of the war, were desperate to pull out, just 2 million there, and desperate to pull out from the main crops of the independent Arab kingdom in Syria. And the mandate system began to take shape. Before the mandate system came out, Faisal got the Allied, the Big Four, to accept the idea of sending a commission of inquiry into the Middle East to ascertain the wishes of the people there. And this commission was headed by a man called Charles Craig. It's formally called the Inter-Allied Commission of Inquiry. They set out for Syria and Palestine in 1919 and came up with, they met an enormous number of people, came up with a very clear understanding that the wish of the people there was for an independent Arab state. But unfortunately, the King Commission did not get anywhere. It was undermined by all kinds of people. The French undermined it. The Americans stopped. Charles Crane himself was an American. Stopped giving it support, and the British were prevaricating as usual. The end result is that the mandate system was established, which imposed a kind of guided rule on the Arab territories in the Middle East. It created basically 3 British mandates, one in Iraq, one in Transjordan, and one in Palestine. The Palestine mandate is already, I think, in terms of reference, that one of the purposes of the mandate was to see the implementation of the Welfare Declaration. The French were given nearly all of it, Southern Syria was Palestine. Lebanon was carved out as a separate state, independent state. Out of this wreckage, out of the wreckage of Turkey nation, we have these 3 3 mandates in this region. And the history of the Middle East since then, or at least that part of the Middle East, has been a history of the instability and the difficulty in establishing a sovereign authority that has legitimacy in these territories. Of course, Palestine morphed into Israel, Transjordan turned into Kingdom of Jordan. Syria was divided actually by the French into different states in the mandates, which sort of cemented the ethno-sectarian division of the country. They had an autonomous region for the Druze, an autonomous region for the Allawites. They cut off the linkages between the Lebanese port of Tripoli and the hinterland of Homs. And the 2 completely different administrative systems were established in the British territories versus the French territories. This is really the legacy of these 3 major events, meetings, exchanges that took place between 1915 and 1917. And I must say, we're still continuing to come to terms with this legacy. With that, I